This isn't the story of a wandering spirit or a flickering shadow in the hallway. This is the story of a house where an entire family was slaughtered in their sleep. A home that turned into a crime scene so bloody and horrifying that it etched itself into American history. The address alone has become infamous: 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York. Before it became one of the most notorious haunted houses in the world, it was first a house of murder, a place where reality was already darker than fiction. On November 13, 1974, in the quiet Long Island community of Amityville, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. took a rifle and murdered his entire family. His father, his mother, and his 4 siblings Zoll gunned down while they slept. There was no warning, no chance for them to escape. Each was found in their beds, lying face down, as if death had come to them in their dreams. The killings shocked the town, not only for their brutality, but for the strange, almost impossible details that surrounded them. Neighbors said they didn't hear the gunshots. None of the family members appeared to have woken up during the attack. How could a rifle fire 6 times in the middle of the night, without anyone stirring, without anyone running or screaming for their lives? It was as if the house itself had smothered the sounds, sealing them within its walls. The horror of that night turned the house into a permanent wound, and from then on, the address was never the same. Ronald DeFeo Jr., the only surviving member of the family, was arrested the next day. His explanation was chilling. He told investigators that voices in the house had urged him to kill. He claimed he couldn't resist them, that the whispers pushed him toward the massacre. At first, police dismissed this as an excuse, a desperate attempt to escape responsibility. But as time passed, those words, "the voices made me do it," would take on a darker weight, especially when new residents stepped into the house and discovered that something inside Ocean Avenue had not died with the DeFeos. The DeFeo murders were not just a tragedy. They became the foundation of what would later be called the Amityville Horror. Without the bloodshed, the house might have been just another old colonial home in suburban New York. But with that crime, it became something else entirely. People didn't just see it as a murder scene, they saw it as cursed ground, a place tainted forever by death. Think about what it means to live in a home like that. 6 coffins had been carried out of the front door. The upstairs bedrooms had been crime scenes. Blood had soaked into the wood, into the walls, into the very foundation of the place. Even if you stripped the paint, tore out the carpets, and rebuilt the rooms, you could never erase what had happened there. Some houses carry memories. This one carried a body count. The trial of Ronald DeFeo Jr. only cemented the story further. Prosecutors painted him as a cold-blooded killer, fueled by resentment and drugs. The defense leaned into insanity, pointing back to the voices he claimed to have heard. The jury took little time to convict him, and he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms in prison. But while the legal system had closed the case, the house itself felt unfinished, as though the real story had only begun. For the people of Amityville, the murders became a shadow over the town. Parents told their children not to walk past the house. Teenagers dared each other to step onto the property at night. Local papers filled with speculation about what had driven DeFeo to kill, and whispers about the house grew louder. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was built on bad ground, that the land itself was poisoned. Whether you believed the gossip or not, one thing was undeniable. The house didn't just look like a family home anymore. It looked like a warning. And yet, as shocking as the murders were, they were only the beginning of the story. A year later, the house found new owners. The Lutz family, a couple with 3 children, moved in hoping for a fresh start. They knew the history, of course. How could they not? But the price was too good to ignore. A massive 3-story colonial with a boathouse and a pool sold for a fraction of its worth. To them, it was a chance at the American dream. The Lutzes lasted only 28 days. Less than a month after moving in, they fled the house, leaving furniture, clothes, and memories behind. They never went back. What happened in those 28 days became the spine of one of the most famous hauntings in modern history. Swarms of flies appearing in the dead of winter. Doors torn off their hinges, footsteps in the halls when no one was there, and a black ooze dripping from the walls. But more terrifying than any of those claims were the voices, the same kind of whispers Ronald DeFeo Jr. had spoken about. Voices that, according to the Lutzes, told them to leave. That moment, when a family fled their own home in terror, transformed Ocean Avenue from a crime scene into a legend. The murders gave the house its darkness, but the haunting gave it immortality. The Amityville horror wasn't just about death anymore. It was about the idea that a house could hold on to evil, that the despair of the murdered family had curdled into something alive, something waiting. Even today, decades later, the story continues to draw attention. Some dismiss it as exaggeration or fabrication, others point to the inconsistencies in the Lucha's accounts. But the fact remains, 6 bodies were carried out of that house, and the man responsible swore that voices pushed him to do it. Whether those voices were in his head or in the walls of 112 Ocean Avenue may never be fully answered. But for many, the chilling part is that maybe, just maybe, they were both. When you look at the Amityville house, with its pointed roof and iconic quarter-moon windows staring out like watchful eyes, you can't help but feel the weight of what happened there. It's a house that looks ordinary on the outside, but inside, it carries one of the darkest stories in American history. And this is only the beginning of that story. The murders were the spark, but what came after was a fire that spread through books, movies, and generations of haunted tales. In the next part, we go deeper into what happened to the family that dared to move in after the DeFeos, and how their 28 days inside the house became a worldwide phenomenon. If you want to keep following this journey into one of the most terrifying legends ever told, make sure you like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Belmoze, because the house with a body count doesn't stop with murder. That was only the first chapter, and we're just getting started. The murders at 112 Ocean Avenue left the house vacant for a year, but in December 1975, it welcomed new owners. George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, thought they had found their dream home. It was a massive Dutch colonial with a pool, a boathouse, and enough room for their growing family. The price was far lower than other houses of its size and location, and though they knew about the DeFeo killings, the Lutzes convinced themselves that tragedy was in the past. They told friends they weren't superstitious, and to them, the idea of a house being cursed seemed absurd. But almost as soon as they moved in, the family began to feel a presence that was anything but welcoming. It started with the small things. George and Kathy noticed sudden cold spots, rooms where the temperature dropped without explanation. Even with the heat on full blast, pockets of freezing air lingered as if something invisible stood beside them. Strange smells filled the house, sulfur and decay that seemed to appear and vanish without source. At first, they brushed it off. New houses often carried quirks. Pipes groaned, old wood shifted, and drafts crept in. But these weren't the usual quirks of an aging colonial. They were targeted, oppressive, and carried with them a sense that something unseen was watching. As days passed, the disturbances grew bolder. Objects shifted on their own. Doors opened and slammed shut. A crucifix that Kathy hung on the wall twisted itself upside down. The family dog growled at empty corners, hackles raised, as though he could see something his owners could not. For George and Kathy, doubt gave way to unease. For the children, fear was constant. They woke up in the middle of the night screaming, swearing that someone or something was standing in their room. The experiences escalated quickly. George began to change. Friends who visited said he seemed withdrawn, as if the house itself had gotten under his skin. He grew irritable, obsessed with chopping wood to keep the fireplace burning, even when the house wasn't cold. He claimed he heard noises at night, footsteps pacing above their bedroom, doors opening and closing when everyone was accounted for. On more than one occasion, he thought he heard a marching sound, like a group moving through the house in unison. Kathy noticed that George was becoming less like himself, as though the house was shaping him into something darker. Kathy, too, felt the weight of the presence. She said she woke to the feeling of being touched, even when George was beside her, sound asleep. She reported vivid dreams of the murders, seeing Ronald DeFeo Jr. standing over his family with a gun. On other nights, she claimed to see spectral figures at the foot of her bed, shadowy outlines of people who should not have been there. One of the most disturbing episodes involved Kathy levitating above her bed, her body suspended as though invisible hands had lifted her into the air. When she came crashing down, George swore he saw something moving in the dark corner of the room, a shape that faded the moment he tried to focus on it. The children had their own encounters. Their daughter, Missy, claimed she had made a new friend, a pig-like creature with glowing red eyes named Jody. She insisted Jody watched her from outside the window, even when she was on the second floor. George himself later said he saw those eyes staring in at him one night, gleaming in the dark from outside. When he rushed out to confront what he thought was an animal, he found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no sign that anything had been there at all. Some nights, the family reported hearing chanting, low voices in Latin echoing through the halls. At times, it seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the house was speaking. Doors would rip from their hinges, windows would shatter, and a green, slime-like substance began oozing from the walls and ceiling. Even priests were not safe. One priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, visited the house to bless it. He later claimed that while he sprinkled holy water in one of the upstairs rooms, a harsh, disembodied voice ordered him to get out. Terrified, he fled, and soon afterward, he developed a mysterious illness that left him shaken. The Lutzes lasted only 28 days. Less than a month after moving in, they packed up their belongings and fled in the middle of the night. They didn't take their furniture or most of their possessions. They left almost everything behind. George later said that the terror had reached a point where staying even one more night might have cost them their lives. Whatever was in that house wanted them gone or wanted them destroyed. The story of their stay quickly spread. Friends, reporters, and investigators all wanted to know why a family had abandoned their new home so suddenly. When the Lutzes began to speak, their accounts sounded like something from a nightmare. They described levitation, possession, spectral figures, swarms of flies that appeared in the dead of winter, and a general sense that the house was alive with malevolence. Skeptics dismissed their story as exaggeration or fabrication, while believers argued that no one would willingly abandon a dream house without reason. To understand why their story gripped the public, you have to picture the setting. The murders were still fresh in memory. Everyone in Amityville remembered the DeFeo tragedy, and many believed that a place where so much blood had been spilled would never be free of its darkness. For the Lutzes to claim they had been tormented by spirits only added to the lore. It was as though the house was cursed twice, first by murder and then by haunting. One of the most terrifying parts of the Lutzes' ordeal was that it didn't just affect the parents. The children described encounters that mirrored their parents' claims. They spoke of the voices, the apparitions, the glowing eyes in the night. For skeptics, this suggested influence. Perhaps the children were simply repeating what they had overheard. But for believers, it was confirmation. If even the children could describe what they had seen and heard, then something had been there, something the whole family experienced. The Amityville case drew the attention of paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who would later become famous for their involvement in countless other haunting cases. The Warrens declared the house was infested with demonic forces, a vortex of negative energy tied to the murders and fueled by something far older than They believed the land itself was corrupted, a portal that allowed evil to enter and thrive. Their claims were met with fascination, fear, and skepticism, but they added fuel to a fire that was already spreading. The 28 days the Lutz family spent inside 112 Ocean Avenue became the backbone of one of the most famous paranormal stories of the 20th century. Books, movies, and documentaries would all be built on their experiences, turning a suburban home into a cultural icon of terror. For some, their story was proof that evil could attach itself to a place and refuse to let go. For others, it was a sensationalized tale born from tragedy. But no matter which side you fall on, the nightmare of the Lutz family is what transformed the DeFeo murders from a crime into a legend. The Lutz family's stay in 112 Ocean Avenue lasted less than a month. Yet those 28 days left them scarred for the rest of their lives. What began as odd disturbances soon spiraled into full-blown psychological warfare, the kind that wore down their sanity night after night until leaving was the only option left. George Lutz, in particular, became the main target of the house's sinister influence. He was the one who found himself waking up every night at exactly 3:15 a.m. The same time, investigators believed Ronald DeFeo had carried out the murders of his family. It didn't matter if George stayed up late, went to bed early, or tried to fight against it, his eyes would snap open, and he would be wide awake, gripped by an overwhelming dread as though something had nudged him out of his sleep. At first, he thought it might be coincidence, but when it happened night after night, the pattern could not be ignored. On more than one occasion, George swore he saw movement in the dark corners of the room during those 3:15 awakenings. Sometimes it was a flicker of a shadow darting across the wall. Other times it was the clear outline of a figure standing at the edge of the bed. He would jolt upright, convinced someone was watching them, only for the figure to vanish when he turned on the light. George described the presence as heavy and deliberate, like a predator patiently circling its prey. The house wasn't just haunted, it was orchestrating a campaign of psychological breakdown. The rest of the family suffered in their own ways. Kathy Lutz's dreams grew darker. She dreamed of the murders of Ronald DeFeo, pulling the trigger again and again, the sound of gunfire echoing through the house. She began to wake with scratches on her body, marks that she could not explain. At first, she thought they might be from the bed frame or her own nails during restless sleep. But the scratches grew deeper and more deliberate, as though claws had raked across her skin. On one occasion, George claimed that Kathy's face briefly transformed in front of him, aged, twisted, almost unrecognizable. It lasted only a few seconds before returning to normal, but the memory of that distorted visage haunted him long after. The children, too, were trapped in the nightmare. Their daughter Missy continued to insist that her friend Jody, the pig-like creature with glowing eyes, was real. She said Jody told her things, secrets about the house and about the family. George and Kathy tried to dismiss it as imagination, but George himself saw those glowing eyes one night outside the window. He described them as hovering at the level of the second floor, far too high for any normal animal. When he rushed outside with a flashlight, the yard was empty, the snow undisturbed. For him, that was the moment when doubt was no longer possible. Something unnatural was truly in the house. As the days passed, the house seemed to tighten its grip. Doors slammed without cause, furniture moved on its own, and the air filled with sudden cold drafts that made it impossible to stay comfortable. But the most terrifying element wasn't the physical disturbances. It was the psychological weight pressing down on every member of the family. The Lutzes described it as if the house itself were alive, feeding on their fear, amplifying every doubt and weakness. George became increasingly irritable and detached, while Kathy felt drained, as though the house was leeching her strength. The children grew quiet and withdrawn, refusing to sleep in their rooms. The atmosphere grew so oppressive that even visitors felt it. Family friends who stopped by described feeling instantly uneasy. Some refused to go upstairs at all. One visitor swore that, while sitting in the living room, they heard footsteps above them when no one else was on the second floor. Another claimed the house's infamous red room, a hidden space discovered in the basement, radiated a feeling of evil so strong it made their skin crawl. To the Lutzes, it became undeniable whatever was in the house wanted to isolate them, to wear them down until they either submitted or fled. The breaking point came in a whirlwind of terror. George reported waking again at 3:15 a.m., but this time he was certain he was not alone. A shadowy figure stood over him, darker than the surrounding night, watching. He was paralyzed, unable to move or call out. When he finally broke free from the fear long enough to sit up, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving only the echo of its presence. On another night, George and Kathy claimed they were pinned to their bed by an unseen force, struggling against a crushing weight that held them down. Doors splintered, windows shattered, and the sound of marching footsteps reverberated through the house, as though the dead were retracing their final steps. By this point, the children were hysterical. They refused to sleep in their rooms and clung to their parents in terror. The Lutzes could no longer deny the truth. This was not simply a house with bad energy, and it was not just an overactive imagination. They believed they were living in the grip of a full-blown demonic entity. The final straw came one night when they all woke to a deafening cacophonous rings, banging, and the sound of furniture being hurled across rooms. They described it as though the house itself was in chaos, unleashing everything at once. In that moment, the Lutzes made their decision. In the early hours of the morning, they grabbed what they could carry, rushed their children out, and fled into the night. They didn't take most of their furniture. They didn't even gather many personal belongings. They simply left everything behind and never returned. To them, survival was worth more than possessions, and nothing inside 112 Ocean Avenue was worth risking another night. Their abrupt departure became one of the most infamous details of the Amityville case. People wondered if the Lutzes were fabricating or exaggerating. Why abandon so much? Why leave behind expensive furniture and valuables in a home they had only just purchased? To the Lutzes, the answer was simple. They were convinced that staying any longer would destroy them. The story of their flight cemented Amityville as more than just a crime scene. The DeFeo murders had been horrific, but the Lutz family's experiences transformed the house into a legend of supernatural horror. For skeptics, it was a sensational story that could be explained away. For believers, it was proof that evil could infect not just people, but places that walls could absorb suffering and violence and regurgitate it onto anyone who dared enter. The fact that the family lasted only 28 days became central to the narrative. It wasn't a gradual haunting stretched over years. It was a concentrated assault that escalated with terrifying speed. Each night built upon the last. Each terror more overwhelming than the one before, until the house had pushed them to the brink. By the time they fled, they weren't just frightened, they were broken. Convinced the house itself had a will, and that its will was destruction. The Amityville Horror might be one of the most famous ghost stories ever told, but it has always carried a shadow of doubt. For every person who believes the Lutz family's account, there are others who claim the haunting was nothing more than an elaborate hoax designed to make money. The controversy began not long after the Lutz family abandoned the house, leaving behind furniture, clothing, and their carefully built dream of a fresh start. Within a few years, the haunting had been transformed into a full-blown cultural phenomenon thanks to Jay Anson. Best-selling 1977 book, The Amityville Horror, A True Story. The book cemented the Lutz's version of events into popular culture, but it also sparked the first serious claims that the entire haunting had been fabricated. Critics began to notice patterns that felt more like dramatic storytelling than lived experience. The book was filled with pacing, dialogue, and cliffhanger-style scenes that read more like a novel than an eyewitness account. Skeptics accused George and Kathy Lutz of exaggerating or inventing the haunting while collaborating with Anson to create a story that would sell it. The book was a massive success, and Hollywood quickly followed with a film adaptation that made the Amityville legend an international sensation. From there, sequels, spin-offs, and documentaries flooded the market, each one building on the chilling foundation of that first narrative. But behind the fame and fortune, questions about credibility refused to fade. Reporters, paranormal investigators, and even neighbors began pointing out contradictions in the Lutz's story. For example, George claimed to have seen hoof prints in the snow outside the house tracks he believed were left by a demonic creature. Yet weather records from the time showed there had been no snowfall during the period when the family said the haunting took place. Small details like this became ammunition for skeptics, who argued that the haunting was less a supernatural encounter and more a carefully constructed performance. Then came the accusations of financial motivation. After fleeing the house, the Lutzes found themselves in financial trouble. They were facing debt and looking for ways to recover. Skeptics argue that the haunting became their ticket out a dramatic, terrifying story that could be monetized, and it worked. Not only did the Lutzes profit from the book and movie deals, but the story gave them a strange kind of celebrity status, with appearances on talk shows and interviews where they retold their story again and again. There were also whispers that their lawyer, William Weber, played a role in shaping the haunting narrative. Weber represented Ronald DeFeo Jr., the man who had murdered his family in the house. Some accounts suggest that Weber, the Lutzes, and even Jay Anson had late-night meetings where they brainstormed sensational details to spice up the story. Weber himself later claimed that the haunting was a hoax, something he said they concocted over bottles of wine. If true, it would mean that the Amityville Horror was not born out of terror, but out of negotiation, invention, and profit-seeking. But the controversy did not silence believers. Paranormal researchers, psychics, and ghost hunters insisted that while some details may have been exaggerated, the Lutzes had still encountered something genuinely sinister. The family themselves always stood by their account, even when mocked or accused of lying. George and Kathy repeatedly said they had nothing to gain from putting themselves in the spotlight and exposing their children to ridicule. For them, the story was a matter of survival, not financial benefit. They claimed they fled the house because the fear was unbearable, and they wrote the book to warn others about the power of dark forces. As the decades passed, the legend grew while the truth became harder to separate from fiction. Every documentary, every interview, and every dramatization seemed to blur the line further. Some paranormal investigators reported strange feelings and unexplained phenomena when visiting the house, while others said it felt completely normal. Skeptics pointed to the ordinary lives of later owners who never reported a single haunting event as proof the Lutzes had lied. Believers countered that the evil in the house had been awakened by the murders and tormented the Lutzes specifically, perhaps feeding on their vulnerabilities. The clash of belief versus skepticism is what keeps the Amityville story alive. If the Lutzes fabricated it, then they pulled off one of the greatest hoaxes in paranormal history, creating a horror franchise that has lasted for nearly half a century. If they told the truth, then the Amityville Horror stands as one of the most terrifying examples of a haunting in modern times. Proof that trauma and evil can cling to a place long after the blood has dried. Even today, the debate rages on. Paranormal enthusiasts continue to swear that the Lutzes story bears the hallmarks of genuine possession and haunting. Pointing to patterns seen in other alleged cases of demonic activity, skeptics remain firm, arguing that every claim has either been debunked or explained through psychological stress, suggestion, or outright invention. The Amityville Horror has become more than just a ghost story. It has become a cultural mirror, reflecting our fascination with fear, the unknown, and the possibility that people will do almost anything for fame and fortune. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story of the Lutz family has forced us to ask uncomfortable questions about where fact ends and fiction begins. And that, perhaps, is why it endures. Whether the Amityville haunting was real or fabricated, there is no denying its grip on the imagination of millions. Few stories have managed to blur the line between true crime and supernatural horror in the way this one has. At its core, the Amityville saga began with the brutal murders committed by Ronald DeFeo Jr. in November 1974. A tragedy that shocked a quiet suburban town. But what followed the claims of the Lutz family, the best-selling book, the movies, and the decades of debate transformed one house on Ocean Avenue into a symbol of haunted evil that refuses to fade from memory. The Amityville horror franchise became one of the most recognizable names in horror history. Jay Anson's book set the foundation, written with the cadence of a suspense novel while being marketed as fact. Readers devoured it, fascinated by the chilling blend of the ordinary and the paranormal. The book's success caught Hollywood's attention, leading to the 1979 film adaptation that brought the story to a massive audience. That movie introduced iconic imagery, the glowing windows that looked like eyes, the priest tormented by unseen forces, the family's desperate flight that became instantly tied to the haunted house genre. Even people who had never heard of the DeFeo murders knew about Amityville because of that film, and it didn't stop there. Sequels, prequels, and spin-offs followed, each one adding to the mythos. The franchise became so expansive that it covered everything from demonic possession to cursed objects and even to tales that stretched far beyond the original house. Filmmakers returned to the Amityville name again and again because audiences could not resist the allure of a story that claimed to be rooted in truth. Even if critics dismissed later films as cash grabs, the brand endured. For horror fans, Amityville wasn't just another movie, it was a touchstone, a cultural landmark that linked the thrills of fiction to the terror of real events. The house itself became a kind of celebrity. Tourists traveled to Amityville just to catch a glimpse of it, snapping photos of the Dutch colonial with its quarter-moon windows. For years, the address was well known, and the house was constantly surrounded by curious visitors and paranormal investigators. Eventually, new owners altered the appearance of the home, removing the distinct windows to discourage attention. But even with those changes, people still whispered about it, still drove by, and still pointed to it as if looking at a gateway to the unknown. The legacy also seeped into other parts of pop culture. Television shows, documentaries, and even comedy skits referenced the Amityville story. It became shorthand for the haunted house archetype, the story against which all others were compared. Ghost hunting programs returned to the case over and over again, each trying to solve the mystery once and for all. Musicians, writers, and even video games have taken inspiration from the chilling legend. What started as a tragedy and a controversial haunting became a blueprint for modern horror storytelling. But the fascination with Amityville goes beyond entertainment. It touches something deeper about how people grapple with fear, faith, and the unknown. For some, the story validates the belief that evil can infest a place and drive ordinary people into madness. For others, it's a cautionary tale about gullibility, showing how isolated stories can be manipulated and sold to the public. Either way, it continues to spark debate, which is why it has never truly disappeared from conversation. The cultural impact can also be measured by the number of paranormal enthusiasts who point to the Amityville case as their entry point into ghost hunting and research. Many investigators say this was the story that first made them believe, or at least made them curious enough to seek answers. Even skeptics often admit that Amityville is where they began asking questions about how stories spread, how fear works, and how narratives can take on lives of their own. Every new generation rediscovers it. A teenager reading about the case today will likely find the same mix of horror and intrigue that captivated readers in the 1970s. They'll stumble onto the movies, the documentaries, the debates online, and feel pulled into the same cycle of fascination. The fact that this single case has remained relevant for nearly 50 years shows its power. Most ghost stories fade into obscurity, but Amityville thrives, standing at the crossroads of folklore, crime, and Hollywood imagination. And that is the final piece of its endurance, is both real and unreal at the same time. The DeFeo murders are fact. The Lutz family's haunting is disputed. The movies are fiction. Yet together, they create something larger than any single version. It is a story that feels alive, as if it is still unfolding. Even though the house itself is quiet and its infamous events long past, that ambiguity is what makes it unforgettable. People are drawn to the possibility that a house can carry darkness, that walls can remember suffering, and that evil doesn't simply die with the people who commit it. To this day, the Amityville horror remains a legend because it refuses to be neatly explained. Whether you see it as a chilling tale of supernatural terror or a carefully crafted hoax that captured the public's imagination, the fact remains, changed the way we think about haunted houses forever. And while the truth may never be fully known, the legacy is undeniable. The story has left a permanent mark on popular culture, and it continues to haunt us in ways both terrifying and fascinating. And if you want more stories that explore the dark corners of history, the mysteries that refuse to stay buried, and the legends that walk the thin line between truth and fiction, then make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze, because the Amityville horror may be one of the most infamous haunted tales of all time. But it's only one of many chilling stories waiting to be told.